thank you everyone for coming over this afternoon. My name is Peter Bryant. I'm the Head of Learning Technology and Innovation here at the NOC. And welcome to our last NetworkED for 2016. And I'm very happy to be welcoming James Clay from JISC to be talking. James is the Senior Co-Design Manager at JISC. And it's quite timely because JISC are in the middle of a very large co-design project at the moment, for which there's been lots of Twitter chat, lots of debates and discussions around the future of technology in higher education, the future of learning environments, which is the one I've been participating relatively actively in. So it's quite timely. So without further ado, I shall hand over to James.
Thank you, Peter. I should say I'm a Senior Co-Designer Manager, not the, as my colleagues say. Details, I'll just take the credit. So welcome to this session on what I'm calling Mapping the Teaching and Learning. What I'm going to try and do in this session really is to just talk about the best way of describing it is a derivative of some work that was previously done by people like Dave White, Donna Lanclow and Laurie Phipps on visitors and residents, but actually applying it to teaching and learning. And actually thinking about it in the context of how do we embed digital and digital technologies into that whole process. So that's going to kind of go through to kind of just remind people of visitors and residents. We may watch the video, depends how far people are ahead on that one. Then start thinking about what the mapping is, and then eventually where we get to is, actually this is really great, but it's only a snapshot. I'm more interested in that journey. How do I get from A to B? So just for those who are interested, you can go to the blog, blatant plug, elearningstuff.net, or you can follow me on Twitter at James Clay. So let's bit of quick audience participation. You want to embed digital into teaching and learning. You want to embed, what are some of the issues that you come across? Okay, what are some of the barriers then? Resistance. Okay, people are resistant to change, resistant to things. Nodding there. Cost. Funding. So there's an issue of, we could talk about time, couldn't we? There's always a clock in there. Lack of skills. So lots of reasons. So we're just going to, so we've got time as in the Informal one. Legacy. I have always done it this way. I like my typewriter. There's nothing wrong with my, writing memos and so on. We've got this huge stuff that we've had all there before. Why would I want to change it? We know it works. We know our students like it and so on. So, but some of the kind of key issues that we often think about here are things like, I realise I can't actually see my own board, but nor can I read this because I need my glasses. There's things like legacy and history. The fact we've already done it. But actually I think there's also an aspect of potential. I don't know what the technology does. And I have no idea of its applicability or how I can use it. But one of the key things we have to remember is actually one of the biggest problems with embedding digital, but it's also one of the real opportunities, is people. We want people to change. We want people to do things differently. So what I'm going to start just focusing on in this kind of session is about learning and teaching. So when we start talking about visitors and residents, and the kind of mapping that we see there, it's often very much more about communication and collaboration and participation. So let me just ask the question in terms of doing it. Who here has heard of visitors and residents? Okay, and of those people who've heard of it, who here has actually mapped their practice? There's about 2 in the room, right? So we might be useful to kind of just give an overview. So where this comes from is from a bloke named Dave White, who's now working at UAL. And what he realised was there was this whole kind of issue about digital natives and digital immigrants. So if you were born after 1983, you were somehow conversant with digital technologies, whereas if you were born before that, you found them dangerous and something that maybe ought to be banned. The reality, as we know, is it's not that simple. And what Dave kind of put together is this concept of there are some online spaces where you are resident and there are some online spaces where you are a visitor. So quick question, who here has bought something from Amazon in the last week? There we go. So what did you buy? If you can tell us, you can always lie.
Cleaning things.
Cleaning things in terms of doing it. Now, did you just go there did you leave a review? No. In terms of doing it. So you can see that very example of a visitor experience. I went to Amazon, I bought something, I then left. I mean, you have to have an account, you have to have all those kind of things. But actually it wasn't really, you just go in there and coming back again in terms of doing it. Anyone here written a review for Amazon? Yeah, Peter, what did you write a review of? Don't tell me cleaning materials.
It was a product of a record cleaning product that I bought.
Oh, what's a cleaning product? Cleaning record, slightly different, but it's still in terms of doing it. And anyone here use TripAdvisor to go and find somewhere to eat? Anyone here writing reviews for TripAdvisor? You can see the difference. If you go to TripAdvisor just to see what other people are saying, you're kind of visitor, other things. So, but also if you start thinking about professional services as well, you things like some people who has their email on all the time. Anyone have their email? You know, because you love those little pop-ups. You know, no matter what you're doing, I need to know what's the problem with the car parking, all those kind of things. So what we'll do now is I'm going to just show a bit of Dave White because he does explain it a lot better than I do. I just have to.
Young people, they're good with using digital technology, aren't they? It's easy for them because they grew up with it. Going online, using the web, it comes naturally to them.
They learn how to use technology the same way they learn their own language, by being immersed in it from a very early age. It's this metaphor of language which underlies the digital natives and immigrants idea put forward by Mark Prensky at around about the turn of the century. The theory goes that if you're young enough to have grown up with digital technology, then you're native to it.
If you're that little bit older and didn't grow up with access to the web, for example, the way you use it will be like attempting to speak a second language. It won't be innate. In this way, you're an immigrant in the online world, and you will never gain the natural fluency with the web that those who grew up with it have.
This notion was and still is very attractive, but over time it's become casually simplified into old people just don't get this stuff. The idea that past a certain age, there's very little chance of you elegantly adapting to the digital environment, leaving behind a generation fossilized in their pre-digital habits. The digital natives and immigrants idea also encouraged the attitude that we didn't need to teach younger generations how to use technology. The expectation was that they were going to teach us.
But being socially adept at Facebook or owning the latest phone, for example, is not a foundation for using the web effectively for study, for critically evaluating a range of digital resources, or even having the capability to formulate and express cogent arguments online. These are examples of learning literacies which don't come for free with the latest technology. Literacies which are all the more crucial as learning continues to move online and beyond institutional boundaries.
In recent years, even Prensky himself has grown wary of the digital natives and immigrants idea, as it's become ever more clear that age is not the predominant factor in the successful engagement with digital technology and the web. Now, I propose an alternative model to understand our relationship with the web. It's one that's not based on age or technical skill, but on our motivation to engage, visitors and residents. It's a simple continuum of modes of engagement, and we can use it to map our use of services and platforms online, and, importantly, how and why we use those platforms. Using visitors and residents as a lens can help reveal underlying approaches and attitudes, which in turn can help us to support and engage the people we work with. As I mentioned, this is a continuum, not two hard-edged categories. We're not trying to type people into two groups. In actual fact, most of us will use a combination of visitor modes and resident modes when we go online, depending on the context we're in.
At the visitor end of the continuum, we tend to think of the web as being like a collection of tools, things that are useful for getting a particular job done. So in visitor mode, we decide what we're trying to achieve, rummage around in the untidy toolbox of the web, select a tool we think is going to work for us, use that tool, and then put it back and close the lid. A good example of this would be going online to search for a piece of information, using that information, and then coming back offline again. Or perhaps using the web to pay some bills or book a holiday, those kinds of activities. The point is that in visitor mode, we leave behind no social trace of ourselves online.
At the resident end of the continuum, we think of the web as a series of spaces or places. When we're in resident mode, we're choosing to go online to be present with other people. We're living out a portion of our lives online. This mode of engagement does leave a social trace, one which remains after we go offline.
People who regularly operate in resident mode are very likely to have a profile on a social networking site of some sort. They might be happy to express their opinion by commenting on other people's blog posts or videos, for example. They might even have their own blog or be happy to post photos and videos that they've created themselves.
The extreme end of residency in the continuum involves highly visible activity online and is relatively rare. More common is activity towards the centre of the continuum, where we're active within known communities online. For example, regularly contributing to an email list or posting to friends and family on Facebook. The point is that these types of activity are linked to our identity, our persona. We are residing as individuals online.
Just turn it off.
As I mentioned earlier, context is very influential on our modes of engagement online. So what we can...
So there is we'll share the link. Let me get that going so that people can have a look later, because there are, so this isn't a talk about visitors and residents, but I think we need to have that underlying foundation to understand where I go to next. But one of the things that Dave and Donna Lanklow and Laurie Phipps talk about is they then add a kind of vertical axis, which talks about the difference between personal and professional. So you think about your professional email, your personal Twitter account and so on, and actually starting to map or post kind of squares on that one. And it was that kind of, looking at that kind of process that made me start thinking, actually, could we use this process of mapping our online activities, but actually start to map the learning of our learners? The first thing I realised when you start doing this is that this is very much about communication and collaboration and participation when you look at visitors. But where am I on Twitter, Facebook? It's the web. It's about searching, it's information. It's very little to do with actually kind of engagement or activity with other people. So one of the things I wanted to try and avoid that in terms of doing it, but it was thinking about how do we get this and why would it be useful? That was one of the key things. It's like, you know, it's fun to do, but is it actually useful? So we've got our continuum, we've got visitors and residents, and you know, so we, as we said, resident is at one end, visitor at the other, and it is a continuum. It's something where you may be highly resident in one location, less resident in another, and so on. So the first thing I thought about teaching and learning is, well, let's get rid of those and start thinking about it. So trying to think, what is those kind of core things? And to be honest, you can map anything, but the two that seemed to fit me very well in terms of teaching and learning was engagement and broadcast. And I'll come on to that in a more, but engagement was very much talking about interactivity. So we're doing stuff, we're talking, so this is broadcast, one to many. In terms of doing it, if you think of video is one to, you know, is one to many. Even a book, which is one to one, is still very broad. You know, the book doesn't come back and talk to you or ask you questions in the same way that maybe having a discussion. So if you walk around the library here, it's interesting to see there are some people who are doing activities where it's very focusing on getting information out in terms of doing it, and there are others where people are talking and discussing. So vertical axis is something, because mapping is, you know, you can do it across a continuum, but actually using a vertical axis gives you a lot more flexibility in theory. If you can always do 3D ones, but they're really difficult to visualize, so we try and avoid that kind of thing. But again, it was thinking, well, okay, we've got professional and personal when we start talking about visitors and residents, you know, it's a personal Twitter account, professional email, Yammer, and so on. So again, what could we use here? And actually, to be honest, there's a lot of debate and discussion about what these could be when we start thinking about teaching and learning. I wanted to keep it relatively simple. So what I chose was formal and informal. And what we meant there very much, or what I meant there very much, was formal is probably the best way of describing it. It's kind of scheduled, planned, organised, facilitated. Whereas informal is almost about learner choice. I choose when to do this. And sometimes it's constrained, but most of the time it's about learning. So that's really the difference. We often talk about formal learning and informal learning. And people have said, well, actually, I'd rather have facilitated and unfacilitated or something else. At the end of the day, it's really, the issue isn't what's on the axes. The issue is about how can we map what we're doing in order to understand where we are, but also to understand our practice, but also understand some of the issues that we get back to going back to the very beginning of embedding digital technology. So, the kind of key questions that we need to think about when we're doing this is, for example, where are these people learning? And it's, I was up at, where was I actually? I don't remember where I was. Oh yeah, Bloomsbury Group, and I noticed a load of students learning in a coffee shop. It's like they'd chosen their space where to learn. You walk around here, you see people learning. I've actually seen a few people asleep on beanbags as well, but that's slightly different, in terms of doing it. But again, it's also thinking about that level of engagement. So at this point, at some point, I've been asking you for a bit of audience participation. We've had a bit of discussion. We're going to probably have some questions at the end. So there is some engagement. So you can remember that kind of continuum of where we're going. This is a planned session. But it's something that may then spin off. There may be something, you may start asking me questions via email or something else. You could think of that as very informal. We haven't planned that. So it's really thinking about all those kinds of activities and what we're trying to do. So we've got our graph, and we can start thinking about, right, let's start mapping. So someone give me a basic, what's the basic learning activity that happens in a university? There we go, I knew that one was going to come up. So we can put it in. And that's where we can then start to place some other things in there. I put the library is a good example, where generally, very rarely is the library scheduled into someone's timetable. It's not like you must go to the library between 9 and 10 because that's the only time you're allowed in there, in terms of doing it. A lot of libraries like accessing resources, but often there's a lot of engagement happening. You're engaging with staff, you're asking them for resources and so on. And actually this will vary from library to library depending on the way that it works and the way that it goes on. And then you've got things like, as I said, people drinking coffee, but actually working together. Oh, so you're in my group. Have you seen the latest aside? And discussing and debating. Very informal, but highly interactive and highly engaging. Imagine if they were drinking on their own, then it'd be over here somewhere. Seminars, again, kind of discussion, debate, that's what we're trying to do with that. And then you've got things like study groups. So you've got like formal study groups. You four are working on a project together, and then there's other people who form informal study groups in terms of doing it. So what we have here is a very simple model of what is a very typical kind of approach to teaching and learning in a university or college in the UK in terms of things. So that's great. So we've done that, let's all go. No. Let's just remind us, it's a broadcast, this is kind of, so at this point, if we had about half a day or a whole day, we'd start to map, to actually get you to sit down and get people to actually do this. And it is thinking about, what is broadcast? So you could change that. Some people say, let's just change that to using different words and so on. But, video and podcast would also be in that kind of thing. Let's watch a film and those kind of things. And the same goes for things like engagement. It's thinking of that interactivity, and it is a continuum. So the amount of engagement that you get in the library may be very close, very close to the kind of axes, whereas where people are working together in groups may be further to the right because there's more interactivity in terms of doing that. And as I said, the same with kind of formal and informal. It's just saying that, these are scheduled, these are timetabled, it's institutional, it's organisational, it's planned. We know what we're doing in February, we know what we're doing in May. In terms of we've got all these time, we know where we're going to be at what time and so on, and we have these things booked in. Whereas the kind of informal is very much, should we meet on Friday? Go through that essay? Hi, I need some help with my assignment, and it kind of goes in. So you can even see kind of informal, professional, and that's why I wanted to use formal and informal, because I thought offline and online doesn't really help, and almost like professional, kind of professional or amateur. So that's why I went with those particular things. But you could use other versions. I know somebody said let's use facilitated and free form or something on those kind of lines. But the reality is what you're trying to do is go back to that diagram and start thinking about where it goes. But of course, I'm looking at Jane here because working and Peter working at things. One of the things is that often what we want to do is now to get people to change their behaviours by starting to use digital more effectively. And we use a range of strategies and techniques to do that. So we run a whole series of workshops, a whole load of seminars, we send out emails, we send out letters, we run various things. And so what you then start to get to is you've got your map of your teaching and learning, and then you start to add the digital. So let's kind of add a few things to this. Let's add Twitter. Go do Twitter. It's great. Everyone's on it, in terms of doing it. You go on there, you create a Twitter account, go and find things out, use a few hashtags, whatever they are in terms of doing it. Okay. And then the students can follow you. But the students, of course, say, actually, we go to the coffee shop, let's form a Facebook group. Let's form an informal Facebook group and let's have a Facebook page. And then someone tells you, well, actually, maybe one of the things that you want to do is start using the VLE. Oh, I don't know how to use the VLE. I'll just use it as a content repository, very broadcast. Just put a load of content on there, be fine in terms of doing it. I said, let's add something else in there in terms of doing it. Oh, let's run these webinars. Someone's told me about Adobe Connect or Collaborate. It's great. And there's a bit of interaction. I'm going to ask questions, but it's mainly me just talking to a camera. Find it really hard in terms of doing it. Let's throw a few things into the library. Says, look, we've got all these wonderful ebooks and all these wonderful e-resources. The issue really when it comes to adding digital is we often do it in this kind of piecemeal approach of bolt-on activities to what existed already. And one of the things then we start to see, and somebody said it, I think it was Peter, resistance. And the resistance is because people suddenly see their map, though they may not visualize it that way, they just see their time being taken, or someone else said time, didn't they? Just being taken up with all these bits and pieces that they have to do on top of their existing practice. So I think some of the strategies we use for embedding digital technologies fails because we fail to consider where people are at, but also we see it as something being all extra, adding more and more on there. Oh, let's add a blog as well, because there's nothing like good writing a blog. Oh, can I do YouTube as well? That's great. Have you seen YouTube? Maybe add a few more things in terms of doing. Oh, have you heard of this lecture capture system, Echo 360? It's great. It can record all your lectures, then you can go and edit them in terms of doing it. Things. So often I sometimes think, actually, why are we trying to bolt on sticky tape, duct tape technology onto existing practice? And actually it sometimes means let's start again and start thinking about how do we design our curriculum in a way that is manageable for both the learners, so they're not getting bombarded with a load of stuff, but actually also manageable for the staff, and actually get them to think about how they're going to change, where they're going to get the training, where they're going to get the resources in order to change that practice. So then what we can start to do, same kind of mapping exercises start again. Well, let's take Twitter and let's start thinking about using it more effectively with using a hashtag for the course, for example. We want engagement. We're going to have some tweet chats in terms of doing it. So there's an element of formalization that starts to drop down here. Let's Facebook. We're going to tell people, expectations of Facebook usage. You can form your own groups and so on. But one of the things we'd like you to do is someone to do a weekly summary or a monthly summary. So it starts to maybe formalize it a bit in terms of doing it. The VLE becomes more effective, but as a result, what you then do is you then start to think about, well, maybe I need to do lectures less. So you start thinking about how I'm going to use webinars. You're not trying to crowd it all out with everything. So you suddenly think, well, actually, this is just a content repository. How am I going to get them to use the engagement tools, whether that be a discussion forum or some other kind of aspect, a wiki, and those kind of things, and thinking about how that maps out. What am I actually going to do? So we're just talking about activities here, not necessarily topics. Maybe we want the students to start creating their own blogs and talking about blogs and commenting on blogs rather than just writing. There's a bit of interactivity happening as well. Still got the coffee. Not wrong with going to a coffee shop and doing a bit of coffee in terms of doing that. We can still add, the library could become much more important in terms of the content repository, but also become part of the formal side of things as well. Rather than teachers always trying to find the resources, why don't we use the information professionals we have to actually start directing people to the right resources based on conversations with the academics? So the library becomes an important part of that learner experience. Still got the lectures. Maybe we just have less of them. Rather than every week, it's once a month or every other week or something along those lines, rather than twice and so on. So we start to still have that eventedness, that social gathering of people together, but recognising that having a lecture every week, week in, week out, may not necessarily be the best use of your time, the learner's time, or the most effective way of transmission, kind of transferring information. And maybe we start moving some of these seminars from here to the VLE discussion. So suddenly what you do is you start thinking about I want to look at my curriculum as a whole. I want to look at my kind of learning design as a whole and start thinking about how can I do things differently if I'm going to take advantage of some of the affordances of these modern technologies. And I think when we start thinking about the way that HE is changing, for example, with higher in degree apprenticeships, where a lot of our learners will not be here physically on campus, could we try and design a curriculum using this kind of process, rather than trying to translate what we have already, which works really well for someone who's physically on campus 5 days a week, to a mode where they may not be. You know, if we're talking about having satellite sites because of the Brexit, in terms of doing it, you know, so we're now having an overseas element, but also in terms of about accessibility, inclusion, widening participation, and starting to think very differently about the way we design our curriculum. Now, one of the things I would say is these are just snapshots. It could be, you could think of this as a week, you could think of it as a module, you could think of it as a whole course. But one of the key things is if we just start bolting things on, we kind of lose that balance. And this is about saying, how can we make sure that we balance this out? And that's where I think the area of these is quite useful. If you think about how many hours a typical module is, then you can start to see that if you did 600 hours of lectures and 112 hours of, I'm a real guess there that you do 700 hours. How many hours in a typical module these days? A module, a kind of, you know, university module. 40 hours. Yeah, so you've got 40 hours. It's like if you've got 30 hours of lectures and 10 hours of seminars. If you then add on a VLE, you start to become, well, let's remove that. Let's have 5 hours of webinars. Let's have 5 hours of seminars. That leaves us with 30. You know, you start to bank it in a way. Oh, if we're going to do 20 hours of lecture, you're going to do 5 hours of flipped learning. Well, we'll take that out of the lectures and start to do it. And then that also says maybe, you know, dare I mention the word efficiencies, but actually starting to use space more effectively. So rather than using the space badly, we can actually then start to distribute our learners over time or space and so on. So for me, just this process, so just give a bit of history. I threw this out onto the web in January this year. You know, so here's an idea in terms of doing it. Having played around it and having been a teacher for 10 years, I kind of really like the concept of it. But one of the key things was it worth it? And actually what's happened is quite a few people now across the UK, Glasgow Caledonian have done some work with it, have taken it with lecturers and actually taken them through the process, and they've actually found it a really useful insight into their own practice, but also about future practice, where they want to go. Because there's something about mapping your practice that actually just starts to make sense to people. Oh, I see why this is proving to be such a headache, you know, and that, you know, the resistance starts to crumble, because suddenly they realise that they can do this, and they start thinking more creatively about the way that they want to design their curriculum. So, very easy for me to say this is how you map it. But mapping is just a snapshot. It's point in time. So you can draw a map of where you are. You can draw a map of where you want to be. But I think one of the key questions is, how do you get from A to B? That's the problem with anything like benchmarking. Benchmarking tells you that you are rubbish and there's an aspiration of where you want to be. It doesn't tell you how to get from being rubbish to that kind of perfect state. And so the question I always ask is, when we start to do these things, is how do we move people from A to B? How do you move an institution from a position where technology is seen as a bolt-on and something to stick on? We've designed our curriculum, but we know there's a training need, there's a whole range of other things of how do we move that whole process. So one of the things I want to kind of move on to now, and I think is important, is to think about how do we actually change the culture of our organisation that would allow this to, you know, people to take advantage of this. So I like Roger's diffusion of innovation, partly because it's just basically a normal distribution. You know, that's what we're really saying is, if we were to assess the digital skills and capabilities of staff, say across the LSE, we would probably be able to put them into these categories of some kind, and the majority of people would have a similar skill set. I'm looking at Jane here to think, you know, you've got your enthusiasts and your innovators, and you've got people who say, look, I've been here teaching here 30 years, I'm not going to change. And then you've got this rump in the middle, that kind of really, kind of like, they'll get there eventually. So when was the last time somebody sent a memo? Do you remember, who here remembers what a memo is? It's something we did before email. So if you wanted to tell people stuff, you sent a memo in terms of doing it, or you sent a note. This kind of concept, and we forget that email has become almost embedded into practice. I don't think we've got one in here, but anyone here remember OHPs in terms of doing it? You know, this kind of thing of writing on an acetate, and then rolling it round, or blackboards that go round and round and round, and you're going to get them in terms of doing it. So there's this kind of concept of, we do eventually get the majority to take on board a technology in terms of doing it. But when we start to think about the processes that we use to embed digital technologies, is we often use two strategies. We either use pull strategies or push strategies. And I now need to get a bit physical with the diagram. So I'll just put the phone down. So a pull strategy is often one which is basically focused here and is trying to pull the whole, pull the whole thing along in terms of doing it. Now the problem with that is it's very hard to pull something. Okay, if anyone here ever tried to pull a car, yeah, it's easier to push it, isn't it, in terms of doing it. But the other thing is it's often what it does is just stretches. So what we find is that we often use pull strategies because we talk to enthusiasts, we talk to people who are very early adopters, and we show them new things, and they take it and they run with it, and it's great. So they become more enthusiastic, and all that's happening is this is just getting stretched and stretched and stretched. Whereas the harder thing to do, though it is in fact easier, is pushing the rump, trying to push everybody along. Now it's not saying you do one or the other, because actually, to be honest, I think both work very effectively in kind of collaboration. But it is sometimes understanding is what are you doing? Is it a pull strategy that's going to have a negligible effect on the vast majority of people, or is it a push strategy that's going to change the whole practice? And often different parts of the organisation will use different strategies accordingly in order to do it. And sometimes you want to use pull ones because you only really want the early adopters to adopt it, because it is, it's got its breaks, it doesn't work properly, there's other problems with it. Whereas push is trying to get everybody to maybe change their entire practice. And I think it's always useful to start thinking about some of these strategies and the ways of doing it. Now, what I'm going to actually do is to show you some real life examples of pull and push strategies that I have personally done, and decided to be personal about this, that I believe have had an impact on the organisation I worked at. So the first one is a pull strategy.
Next tonight, many parents face a daily battle trying to cut down the time their children spend playing on games consoles. So it might come as a surprise to find that some students are using them every day at school.
At one college, they're such an important part of the furniture that teachers say they're contributing to better attendance and higher grades. Our education correspondent, Richard Payne, reports. A basketball class in a college gym, about as far removed from computers as you can get. Also, you'd think that these students are embracing both, using handheld consoles not to play games on, but to analyse their game on.
It makes you playing better. You want to work harder, so because obviously you're on camera.
Great idea, because it's different from writing all the time, doing PowerPoints, because you can just video quick and easy.
You've got PSPs at home and played war games on them,
No.
You tempted to take any of them home with you?
Yeah, I would actually, yeah.
Gloucestershire College used part of a £300,000 grant to buy 64 PSPs available to any of its 5,000 full-time and 15,000 part-time students across their 3 sites.
Been out, you've used the PSPs, you've been around the college, the edit you've done will give us the feeling that Gloucestershire College is somewhere sitting nicely in a nice warm place in France.
From hairdressers to engineers and these business students, some of whom use the technology during the winter snowstorms to maintain their studies while stranded at home. Is this a soft option?
It is anything but a soft option. These guys are interested in new ways of doing things. They don't just want to sit down with a textbook and regurgitate somebody else's ideas. They want to go out, do real things with equipment like this and all the other kinds of equipment we might be using, and come back with real tangible results which they can take ownership in.
And the consoles are not restricted to the teen generation, nor those who don't have English as a first language.
When you concentrate and you try to be in the same level with young people, it's keep you young, I think.
We can get involved in all the situations that you would deal with up in the air.
These travel and tourism students role-playing as air hostesses in the college's very own aircraft cabin use the consoles for part of their coursework as an alternative to the written word, before uploading it and sending it to their tutor. Well, there seems no doubt the possibilities for these clever little things are endless, but do they really have a place in the classroom? Should students be limiting their use to their own time and not college time?
These are devices that our students are familiar with, so they're very quick and easy to pick up. They can create content, they can use them to view content, and it helps them with their learning. It engages learners, so they may not be very interested in the subject, but a PSP can engage them in that subject and allow them to further what they want to do here at the college.
It would perhaps be unrealistic, though, not to expect students to have just a little game time on their consoles in their own time, of course. Richard Payne in Gloucester for the West Country Tonight.
I hope my son's not watching, just imagine seeing.
So to me, that was a poor strategy. I mean, there's a few things you need to wear. 64 PSPs, okay, for 5,000 students. Ain't gonna have. It's not. We knew it was never going to have a big impact in terms of doing it. But it was about, there's a whole combination of things of changing attitudes towards technology amongst some of the teachers, some of the groups. Obviously, the business studies lecturer, Alan Graham, actually now works at the University of Worcester. In terms of, he was one of my real enthusiasts and early adopters, and kind of like, what's new, James? What can I play with? What can I do? These kind of things. And also the other thing about these kind of technologies is also who here still has a PSP in terms of doing it. These devices, the phones have almost taken it over in terms of where we're going. I think one of my most amusing bits is the kid at the end who's playing a video game on it. We had no games, and the BBC TV crew said, ITV TV crew said, can we film somebody playing the game? It's like, how the hell are we going to do that? So we had to take a trailer off a video and put it on the device. It was just, so it's just pretending. It's just those things, the kind of the magic of television. But, this is one of many pull strategies that we use, with technologies. It was also, did you notice, a £300,000 grant. It was part of a mobile learning initiative that we were part of. And this is kind of project-based. Let's do a project on this. Let's do this. And they're very intangible. They don't last very long. They do things. And to be honest, we weren't trying to change the institution. We were just trying to understand a bit more about mobile technology, improving the experiences for a range of learners, and actually destroying some of those myths about, this is quite a few years ago now. I think it's 2009, so it's about 7 years ago. I looked a lot younger then, obviously, in terms of doing it. But it was, we had our own reasons for doing it. But we also had a recognition and a realization that this was never going to change the entire culture. But we're not alone in doing these kinds of things, so just these are more kind of recent examples. So tell champions, which is one that we often see a lot. We're going to get a champion, they're going to do things. Generally, experience has shown us over the last 15 years that champions have a very little impact on the whole culture or holistic approach to embedding of digital technologies. They work really well with individuals, they move people along, they can move people along that spectrum or whatever you want to do it. But generally we have found that they don't have that kind of huge strategic change that we kind of expect them to have. And there's other things as well. Often things about developing screencasting, this is the little pieces and stuff like this. There's nothing saying that these are wrong. What we're saying is don't expect them to have a revolutionary impact on your organisation, because they're not going to. No one has ever done that using these kind of things. They might have done it in a consultation with a range of other things, and that's really more to do with the kind of push strategies. So again, let me show you an example of a push strategy.
Gloucestershire College has 3,500 full-time and 10,000 part-time learners. Not surprisingly, the college uses technology to maintain links with its large student body, and its commitment to innovation from the principal down has meant that the college now enjoys national recognition.
Stars and Stripes is our in-house system for managing and monitoring learners' performance.
Learning analytics back in 2007.
We have about the learners in one place. It means that course teams can intervene much more quickly when things are going wrong.
If you want to embed learning technologies into the college, you do need a whole college approach. You need the vision from the principal, the buy-in from the staff, but also the buy-in from the learners as well.
And the students are always commenting on how good the technology in the college, but of course they always want it to be better, and they drive us forward.
Okay, folks, we all there?
I think it's made a massive difference. Our retention and achievement has gone in excess of 90%. That's an increase of about 24 to 25%.
The way we teach using mobile devices and the use of technology, I think better reflects how they like to learn and want to learn.
what I like to do is give learners a choice. So we've got, for example, people videoing techniques to a student who wasn't there or wants to review it again at home or in the workplace can.
Because we have students, obviously, that are on apprenticeship schemes. Some of the students work away, so they can work around whatever their work and personal commitments are.
It makes it much more personal. It puts the learner in charge of their learning.
I cannot really imagine us not having it.
You may remember someone called Bector. We won the award in 2009, 2010. But one of the things I think, when I talk about a push strategy, this was about changing the entire culture of the organisation. It was about putting innovation and the use of technology throughout the organisation. So that, it was key that we had that senior management buy-in. The principal's there, he buys the vision, he's delivering the vision. Senior management team, Mike Skinner was there, he's one of the senior managers, was putting in there that vision. But the other thing we did was make sure that all the middle managers were also part of that. And that was where you saw that variety of curriculum, whether it was engineering, whether it was crafts, or performing arts in terms of doing it. And we had the staff buy-in, so they were all, there was expectations about how those staff would do things. We weren't expecting them to do everything, and nor were we expecting them to be innovators in everything. What we said is choose one thing. Become good at that, then choose something else, and then choose something else. So we wanted people to use the VLE as a repository. Everyone said, oh, it's a really bad way of using the VLE. Actually, no, using the VLE as a repository is better than not using the VLE, because it allows students access to the resources at a time and place that suits them on the device that they're choosing. To me, that is absolutely a wide way of widening participation and inclusion. What you then want to do is then get that teacher to move on, and that's the key, is how do you keep them moving on? And it was just about, innovation was, we tried to do it by just doing everything around. So, the principal message was about technology. When we went to meetings, it was almost like a standing item in terms of doing it, of what we're trying to do. There was a thing about getting people to make it as part of their performance reviews, their appraisals, so it was embedded into that whole process. And it was also about not being judgmental, bizarrely enough. We weren't saying things, we want to know what people were doing, we're trying to do exciting. So actually what we saw was everybody, it was pushing the rump. The whole use of technology in that college moved, it went along. And to be honest, we talk about culture change. People say cultures are really difficult to change. Personally, I've never found that. I think there are some things which are really hard to change, but you can change culture. And I reckon in about 2 years, we went from an organisation, when I arrived, I said, James, we're chippies and brickies, we don't do technology, to the ones where they broke their flash-based video cameras. I still haven't worked out how they did that. They wore out a flash-based video camera. There was no moving parts. How could they do it in terms of doing it? So it is, I think, really quite interesting of getting that thing. But it is, and again, today we see things. But before we go through that, this is kind of, so what was the verdict? Well, I know we have the QAA and HE. In FE we have Ofsted, and in 2013 we had an Ofsted report, and there was picking out kind of three key things: is extensive and creative use of technology. So coming in, observing lessons, seeing it happen, talking to learners, seeing it happen. Most courses, not all, we still have some way to go, but most means more than, it doesn't mean a minority, it actually means most. And I think the other one was, the one I'm quite proud of, this is the only mention of a library in an Ofsted report over a 3-year period in terms of doing it. Again, that was about pushing that thing, it was about using the library, the informal learning in terms of doing it. We didn't see it as being just technology, it was about that whole learner experience and trying to think what innovation meant in that context. So of course, if we look about what people are doing today, we've got these things. So, creating a stakeholder engagement. Who are the important people? How do we get everybody involved in moving that forward? Don't forget your professional services and your learner support and your business support. There is critical to the success of this as other things. Just going to Hart Worcestershire College, they basically mandated that this had to happen in terms of doing it, and it became part of the curriculum design. This is our strategy. This is what we're going to do, and this is how we're going to do it. And then kind of filtering it down all the way down. But that's, again, nothing in isolation. It wasn't just about doing just push strategies, there were pull strategies as well. So we were playing around with iPads, we were playing around with bits and pieces of technology. But, and if you look across that video, there's different kind of the clickers and everything, but we weren't trying to get everybody to do everything. It was about creating a culture where it was okay to experiment, it was okay to be curious, and it was okay not to engage with everything. Just choose one thing. It became a mantra, just one thing. And that really started to change, that kind of moving, slowly but surely, pushing that rump along until we got a momentum. And I always remember a few conversations I had with people where, I'd go and say, where did that come from? They go, James, we don't tell you everything. Where people are doing stuff themselves. It's a bit like having a discussion forum where you try and get things going, and then when it goes off, Peter, you were saying you've been in the tweet chats, about to us, a tweet chat is a success when I don't have to do anything. When it just goes off on one and people are discussing the topic and the issues in terms of doing it, you've been successful. And that's really what we were trying to do there with the push, was to get people sharing their practice, sharing their ideas with each other, so we didn't even have to start doing it. We could just keep pushing, keeping the pressure on at all levels, but without actually having to do all the work ourselves. I think this is an interesting one in terms of, this is Mark Stubbs from MMU. When they started to think about their curriculum design and kind of put it into this was, everyone told them they couldn't do it because they'd have to change everything. So they said, let's just change everything, and started redesigning it. If you feel that you can't do something because of that legacy, that history and everything else, then don't worry, you're not going to change everything, but sometimes you do need to take a step back and think about, what are we trying to do? What's our strategic approach? And, and we're going back to the beginning of this about mapping teaching and learning. In terms of, I must remember to bring the word uncertainty as well, because I remember that's the theme. Going back to the mapping, teaching, learning is actually it's starting to about having this conversations of getting people to recognise where they are, why they are where they are, where they want to be, or where they think they should be, and then thinking about how you're going to move the institution from that point A to that point B. And recognising there are lots of ways of doing it, but relying on just one, or we're going to just have champions, or we're just going to create a culture of innovation, isn't sufficient. It's thinking that there's, because we come back to this whole argument, an institution doesn't actually exist as an entity in itself. It's made up of the people of there. And it's about getting everybody to think about how are we going to move this whole agenda forward. I love just finding pictures and maps. By the way, my new favourite site, unsplash.com. Okay, just a reminder, it's great for finding not just, these are images that have been donated almost by professional photographers with no need to credit, no need to license. It's really good, and lots of lovely, very high quality, high res images. So I've been finding some lovely images there. So that's why there's no image credits in terms of doing it. So kind of just reflecting on that. To me, this is a useful exercise. More importantly, people have been using it with academics, have seen it as a useful exercise. And it just gives you a chance to kind of reflect on where you are, why you're doing what you're doing, and avoiding that kind of whole process of let's throw lots of new technologies at people and expect them to bolt it onto their existing practice. But there are some sort of things that you could do. So it's, just kind of ideas. One is a team event, map your practice and share those maps. Don't put your names on it, share that and see what's happening. Oh, well, this is interesting. Why are you doing that? And so on. Or I think another one would be get the teacher to map the teaching and get the learner to map the learning, and see what, because in theory, should they be the same? I expect the learner, and that's where you start to get those expectations. What do you mean? You haven't put the library down there at all. Where's the library? It's like, well, to be honest, that's an important part of being an independent learner in an HE institution. Well, we never went to the library at my college, and all that, it's about helping people to understand where they are. Well, what's this? We use WhatsApp or Slack to kind of like have a group. Why using that? Because and all these different things about different ways of working. And of course, if we start thinking about mapping, we talk about visitors and residents, we start talking about teaching and learning, but actually there's lots of ways we can use mapping for other things. Team communication, team collaboration, team working, as well as kind of teaching and learning. So I'm going to stop there and see if there are any questions. Or have I stunned you all into silence? Go on, Peter.
You knew I'd have a question, didn't you? So when I'm looking at the way the activities that you've mapped form a holistic experience for students, so when you have them all glitteringly turn up there on the...
Yeah.
They kind of represent a holistic experience. Where do you fit sort of curriculum design in that? Because ultimately the way those activities get gelled together is through curriculum design. So,
yeah.
So how do you see that fitting through that?
I have been thinking about that, because I was thinking about how can we take this, translate it into something that actually people could then start to do. And it's trying to think, actually, how do people at the moment do their curriculum design? And actually, it kind of relates to a bit of the co-design work I'm thinking. Most people basically, if we talk about a 40-hour module, spread over 40 weeks, they've got 1 hour a week in the same room each week. Okay, and then they kind of break down the topic into those 40 hours. They probably spend an hour each week on it and start to do it. So actually, it then becomes very hard to even do any of this. Because actually, whatever you're doing is just going to be a bolt-on on top of it in terms of doing it. So it's then starting to think, actually, let's just take that 40 hours as a block, okay, and start thinking about how we would expect the learners to use that 40 hours plus whatever. We wouldn't expect them to just do the 40 hours, would we? We'd expect them to, that's the contact time. We would expect them probably maybe an additional 80 hours on top over the year, so 120 hours. What does that 120 hours look like? And where can it be? And then it's something about, actually, how can we do this more effectively? How can we start to break it down into these chunks? So we know that we want them to spend at least this amount of time in the library, but how do we communicate that to the learners? So then I started thinking about, well, how do we actually do this? It's very easy for me to say, and I think of things, and I thought, actually, and it's probably, I'm blaming Jane for this, thing about games and stuff. And actually somebody else thought, there was an event at De Montfort, I think, last week about disruption, which I couldn't get to, but they had decks of cards, and that suddenly got me thinking, was actually, if you start putting that kind of curriculum as a set of cards of what you want to deliver and what you want the students to learn, and then starting to think about the best practices for that. The mapping is one way of doing it, but actually I started thinking you could actually just put the cards out to kind of create and say, actually, the only way this is really going to work is by that video of that guy, because he's the expert on it. It's like me doing this session. I thought, I could talk visitors and residents, but to be honest, why do I need to do it? And Dave's much better at it than I, and he's got, it's his piece of work. Let's him talk about it. He's the expert. So it's like that. So it's the way designing is like, I need a card for the video for that. So this is the subject, and this is how I'm going to do it. So I'm mapping those exercises. Then I think you can start to get a better idea. The challenges that you face is the kind of back end of your university isn't geared up for that kind of curriculum design, and that's where you start to fall down in terms of wanting to do this. Because if you only want a lecture theatre for 3 hours, and then you don't need it for another 6 weeks, you ain't going to get it, are you? It's going to be, rooms are almost impossible to find, but half the rooms in this university are empty. No, it's just a bit of a, but it feels like that sometimes, doesn't it? You can never find a room, but there are always none available. So that's a very long-winded way to say I really don't have an idea, but I'm really starting to think about how we can do this more effectively. Of taking what are snapshots of practice, of where we want to be, and actually how does this actually work on the ground with a teacher, and how does it work with those constraints of physical spaces, timetabling, scheduling, and what everybody else wants to do. So you can't do it in isolation almost. You do need to have that kind of, how does this work from a whole degree perspective rather than just your module. Jane.
Sort of follow up from what you said, because I think the challenge is to stop people just thinking of the content, isn't it? And that they want to deliver and say, this is the kind of chunk, so on, it's going to be, this is the curriculum is kind of often just content rather than the way it's delivered and the activities and the actual learning.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is, this is kind of where the learning happens.
And it's thinking about what is that, this is and it's always about those learning outcomes, isn't it? The learning of, by the end of this module, I expect the learners to be able to understand this or be able to do this, or whatever it needs to do. And actually thinking about it from that perspective, the outcome based, rather than focusing on just, I need to cover these subject areas. I mean, I was a teacher, my first schemes of work, well, this is my syllabus. I can break it down into these 4 modules. In this module, I can break it down into these 4 units, and these units are broken down into these topics. That's 30 topics. I've got 36 weeks. That's great. That gives me a bit of room. So this week I'll do this. This week I'll do that. And it was very much about how that would fit in. And often what you got a very samey. Basically, the students got the same kind of lesson every week. Me at the front, talking a bit about a nice bit of PowerPoint if I had the time to do it, or a bit of acetates, bit of an activity, bit of discussion, and then the day. And it's like, because the room was designed that way, and it didn't even cross my mind to think creatively. Occasionally I did, because you'd have an idea, and so they'd come in one week, and the lesson. I used to teach economics, just to kind of put it, which is quite bizarre being here actually, in terms of doing it. So I used to teach economics, and when I did the chocolate lesson, which people still talk about 20 years later, in terms of, I bumped into people in the street, go, oh, I remember the chocolate, in terms of it. It was about the creation of money, in terms of it. So we had a game, and it was a barter economy. And then I introduced gold, and it was Whisper Golds. Do you remember those? Go Bards. And there was one person who goes, we won the game, because they had all the goods. And another group said, we won the game, because they had all the chocolate, in terms of doing it. But it was that game, I remember reflecting, that was really good. That worked so well as a lesson. But no one had actually taught me about curriculum design. No one had told me about learning design. No one had told me about different activities. And they often did it in the context of a single lesson, but not as an overall module. And of course, what we often don't reflect on, and certainly this is something we were talking about Gloucestershire College, was you can have an amazing lesson, but if you were doing the chocolate game for your first 2 hours, and then you're doing another chocolate game, and then you're doing a third chocolate game, I can tell you by the 4th session, you're going to be sick of chocolate in terms of doing it, because it's going to be the same kind of experience. There's something about, actually, let's have a lecture to begin with, then let's have it's about breaking it up, and I think that's where curriculum design is really hard to do, because often you're not doing it, you've got your 1 hour a week. And if everyone's been creative and engaging and interactive, it can actually be quite boring, because it's actually people having the same very disappointing activity, or everyone's using the same technology or the current fashion and fad. So I think that's where it becomes, to me, that's almost, we probably don't even have the tools and resources to do it, to enable us to understand what that learner experience is. I mean, the way that we used to do it was follow learners. And actually you started to realise that even though this cohort of students were having an amazing, outstanding experience, actually they weren't, because everyone was doing this outstanding experience and it was just the same each time, and they were just disillusioned and getting bored. Any more thoughts and questions? Oops, you're not playing properly. No.
Well, rather than me getting in front of Mike's camera, I'll sit here and say once again, thank you, James, for your talk. Round of applause to James, it'd be lovely. Just a small piece of advertisement. Our next announced NetworkED will be next year in March, where we shall be welcoming the Vice-Chancellor of Loughborough University to talk about how they've now got themselves into the top 10. So it'll be very interesting to talk about the transformation that's occurred there as well. So that's on the 1st of March.